Chapter 11. Boys Become Men. We generally got up late in comparison with the savants. For them the day began even before the sun showed signs of returning to complete yet another cycle of blinding light and searing heat. When it did appear to sweep away the shadows and evaporate the drops of nocturnal humidity that trickled from the roofs of the huts. The savant had already been busy for some time preparing to satisfy his primary impulse, hunger. By the time we got out of our hammocks, the men were far away, occupied in hunting. The women were going out to gather wild fruits, fetch water or firewood, or were weaving palm fiber containers. Occasionally a solitary male might still be left in the village because he was seriously ill or was performing some special task, finishing off the fashioning of a spear, or new arrows, or personal ornaments, or making mats. However, the village was never entirely deserted. There was a permanent guard of sentinels occupying the heights and the passes up to the very cliffs of the Serra do Roncador. These warriors belonged to different clans who took turns in the execution of this duty. Therefore we were surprised one morning to find the savants still inside the village, though the sun had already risen. We observed them well, in case we might be up against some impending incident. But while the women were filling baskets with young coconuts, palm shoots, and hunks of meat, the men seemed normally engaged in polishing their bows, adjusting their arrow feathers, or simply reclining on the mats. Nevertheless, there was something new in the air. For the first time since our arrival, they seemed aware of our presence among them. They looked at us without misgivings, and with candor, even with a certain friendly tolerance. We responded with greetings and signs of affection, which for the most part were reciprocated. One of the sons-in-law of the chief, of severe and grave expression, the one who had invited me to take part in the ritual dance, and a captain-elect, came over to us. As if he had never seen it before, he pointed to my sleeping net and said, "Mo ro pi po, show me." Pleased at the interest he was showing, I did so. As soon as he had examined it, he indicated something else and repeated, "Mo ro pi po." His curiosity was insatiable. We were beginning to turn out the whole of our equipment for his inspection, when an infernal din of shouting from outside galvanized all the occupants of the hut, including the son-in-law of the chief, whom we were about to christen, Norma and I privately, Mo ro pi po. Many of the inhabitants of the village were reclining outside their huts, watching an enthusiastic and boisterous band of boys who, painted black from head to foot, and with the familiar headbands of vegetable fiber around their brows, were bounding into the air in a cloud of dust, and howling rather than singing. We recognized many of our young friends. Each boy was exerting himself in an effort to yell and leap more energetically than his neighbor. Suddenly they became silent and still. I expected to see the chief approaching, but it was Siru Pre, the one-eyed captain. He went up to the group of boys and gave an order. Again the air was filled with shrill, frenzied yells, and the savant boys broke into a mad rush towards the Waztap hut. They did not stay long in the hut, which was segregated from the others, but that short visit brought to an end years of wearying apprenticeship in the tough school of warriorship. Those who were leaving today were, so to speak, the graduates. They had distinguished themselves by their keenness, dedication, and intelligence, and had learnt how to make their own weapons, and how to use them. They were now familiar with warrior tactics and the warrior tradition of their tribe, expressed in songs. They had proved able to sustain themselves by the resources of the jungle, and learnt how to uncover its most jealously guarded secrets. This was their day, the most important day of their lives. It was hard to recognize those chattering children we had got to know so well as these same serious-faced, austere young men who were now leaving the hut, painted black but bearing the arms of a man, spear, bow, and arrows. They showed by the haughty expression on their faces that not only their weapons had changed, but their spirits too. Looking straight ahead of them, they marched to the center of the village. A shout like a bark, the warriors' alert, set them in motion. One by one they responded to the cry in the same way, then they broke into a trot, heading for the mountains, accompanied by an instructor, a high-ranking captain. Pray Na explained to us that they would go on running until the night was well advanced. Then they would plunge into the stream, and there they would remain till daylight, which would mark the end of their test of endurance. In the meantime, these prospective warriors must not eat or drink anything. The sun became hotter and hotter until at midday the thermometer recorded 118 Fahrenheit. The air boxed in by the mountains was unbreathable. To get out of the shade was to sweat copiously, and to take off our pith helmets was to be frizzles. But as regularly as clockwork, every so often could be heard in the distance the barking of the 15 prospective warriors, proclaiming to the village that they were carrying out their orders faithfully. Shortly after midday, the column of youths left the terrible, rugged, stony mountain zone behind them and came running through the middle of the village. The pounding of their feet in the dust had caused a grayish film to cover them, which clung to their black paint and mingled with the oil with which they had anointed their hair. Some had wounds and welts where they had injured themselves in falling on the rocks and were caked with dried blood over the dust-filled gashes. Others could hardly put their feet firmly to the ground because of the effects of the rough, uneven road over which they had traveled. But without exception they all retained the proud, virile expression their faces bore when they first emerged from the Maloka. Not a word or cry was uttered by those who watched. Not a single mother gave vent to her feelings. The captain who had escorted the boys now stayed behind, and another warrior took his place and urged on the boys to quicken their pace. The line of Zavant youths disappeared into the distance, passing on into an area with which we were well acquainted. It was semi-desert and without any protection from the sun, which at this hour of the day would wreak cruel havoc upon the dedicated lads. The sun sank and the heat abated. First there was a cooling in the air, and then positive cold. Every member of the tribe whom we saw coming from the direction in which the future warriors had headed caused a flutter at our hearts. We were afraid that some youngster had been unable to endure the test, but nothing of that sort occurred. It grew dark and we had our evening meal. I was filling my daily pipe when the barking sound of the savants' alert reached us clearly. Like everyone else, we went outside the hut. A captain was approaching at the head of the group of boy warriors. The fast pace of the morning had become a plodding trot by now. By the light of the fires we could see clearly the unmistakable exhaustion, gaunt faces and compressed jaws, lips parted and bleeding, all mingled with dust, sweat, blood, and paint. Yet through this bedraggled and pitiful aspect shone a determination. The former haughtiness was still there, now joined with pride at the certainty that they were winning through. They said not a word, and nobody spoke to them. They went on at the same trotting pace towards the stream that came down from the mountains, and they entered it up to their shoulders. Unconsciously I shivered. I was wearing a thick undervest, a shirt, and a wind jacket, yet I was feeling the iciness of the atmosphere. When I thought what that stream must be like, which even with the noon sun pouring upon it was always cold, I could not help shuddering instinctively. A number of fires sprang up on the banks of the stream, and the instructors ordered the boys out of the water and then in and out time and time again, all of which the lads obeyed rapidly and in silence. They had been mere boys up to yesterday, and all at once were men. Now their teeth were chattering, and they were shivering with cold from head to foot. Inexorably the captains yelled at them from the bank. If any of them were the least bit sluggish about entering the water again, he was called a few names ill befitting a warrior. Would they withstand this torture? Could they possibly remain firmly afoot and active all those hours which still remained until the new day dawned, getting in and out of the icy water? The spectators drifted back to their huts to sleep. We did the same, leaving the instructors and the youthful warriors to conform to the iron-bound demands of tribal discipline. But I couldn't sleep. We were up at dawn. The tribe had already gathered in the proximity of the stream. The path was guarded by all the men of the village, almost the whole way to the water's edge, at which the tribal council had met, presided over by the chief. At his side on a mat were half a dozen sharp, thin bones in the shape of awls. Beside them lay a basket containing the semi-cylindrical hoods made of vegetable matter which the adult savant male wears over his genital organ, as a sign of his mature virility. The endurance test was over. At an order from the chief, the youths came up out of the water at once. Several of them, as they scrambled up the banks, slipped and fell, only to rise immediately, their muscles cramped by the lengthy exercise and expenditure of their physical energies. Nevertheless, outwardly they showed no more signs of exhaustion than the evening before. As they came up to the tribal council, they were received by Fabre. He made each of the candidates sit upon a new mat, and taking one of the pointed bones, he pierced the lobes of his ears. None of the boys made any sound or revealed any change of countenance, although it was difficult to be sure, through the mud and dirt and the dark circles under them, whether those eyes were glistening a little too much to be normal. Their hands hung limply at their sides, and not a drop of blood emerged from the gaping hole in their earlobes. I guessed that their long immersion in the water had slowed the circulation. Immediately Fabre took from the hands of one of each boy's relatives the cylindrical sticks which the warriors used for earrings, and inserted them in the boy's ears. Then he handed him one of the hoods. Fully cognizant of the significance of the moment, the new warrior rose from the mat, ran his tongue along the hood, and clapped it on his penis without a trace of bashfulness. From that moment forward, he was never to take it off except for his wife, and never in public. Violation of this law would entail his banishment from the tribe forthwith. When once the young warriors had been formally incorporated in the tribe, with the right to marry and to participate in a minor council, they went to their Maloka. We too went away for a time, and the ceremony would not be resumed, as the warriors were resting and painting themselves. 2 hours must have gone by when the young men reappeared, adorned with red paint and black stripes on their calves, their hair well combed and scrupulously clean. The baskets containing food for them, which their mothers had left at the door of the hut, had disappeared. They were wearing necklaces, belts, new bracelets, and anklets, and with all their weapons they made their way in martial manner to the village, followed with eager expectancy by the tribe. The youth, who was their senior in age and rank, began to chant. The rest joined in, and thus was initiated their first ritual dance, which was repeated in front of each of the huts in turn. We appeared to have obtained the tribe's consent to our living among them, which depended of course, upon the degree of cautious prudence we observed. We subsisted on our own provisions, and we never intervened in anything unless called upon to do so. We respected the rules of the tribe. I desired no other man's woman. We were loved by the children, and what was most important, there had not occurred in the village any misfortune or death for which we could be blamed. All this did not mean to say, however, that we had won the approbation of all. There were still warriors who wanted us put to death. That was natural enough, and we understood their reaction to us. The very old ones could not get used to the idea of leaving two white people alive when they had always killed them before. The young ones, especially the warriors of 15 to 18, saw in us a sure means of earning prestige by killing us, and they never neglected an opportunity of making us aware of their antipathy. I drew the conclusion that only the strict discipline that reigned in the tribe kept us from falling victims to an impulsive attack. Nevertheless, our nucleus of friends was expanding. The families we lived with in the chief's Maloka ceased to show apprehension towards us. Thus it was that, during the same evening, after the initiation of the young warriors, a series of events began which owed their origin to the continual whimpering of a little girl. For some days past, one of the chief's daughters had been trying to quieten the child, but without effect. The little girl, about 2 years old, was a bundle of bones, and with a swollen abdomen. She refused the food she was offered, and if she did swallow anything, brought it up again immediately. Her big, feverish eyes seemed to stand out from her undernourished little body, and shone with eagerness whenever she managed to put a handful of earth in her mouth. That symptom, and the fact that her body was covered with pimples and blisters, told us that she was suffering from intestinal parasites. If she were not given some appropriate remedy quickly, she would die in a few days, for she was already in an advanced state of anemia. We prepared a purgative, and taking with us some shinopod pills, the smallest doses we had, we went over to the mat of the chief's daughter. She was a woman of pleasant features and exceptionally fine figure. She smiled at us confidently, and went on talking to the child tenderly, trying to lull her to sleep. Her husband, who was painting with uricum, a vessel made from an elongated gourd, contemplated us with curiosity. He was the chief's son-in-law, whom we called Moro Pipo. Norma sat down beside the group and attempted to take the little girl in her arms. The Indian woman was complacent, but the child took one look at my wife's unfamiliar face and burst into screams of terror, burying her face in her mother's breast. The mother laughed, and her husband followed suit. In the gentlest possible manner, I explained that unless the child took what I was trying to give her, she would die. As they considered us their friends, they took this quite naturally, as nobody in the tribe ever offered to help in anything unless he was qualified to do so. Little by little the child became calmer, and when Norma showed her a gold medallion she wore around her neck and dangled it up and down, she managed to overcome the little girl's intractability and to get her to swallow the purgative. The tablets were quite another story. She spat them out, and her mother did not try to make her take them. We were on the point of giving it up as hopeless when a voice we knew well intervened. The chief was ordering his daughter to give the child the tablets by force. The young woman did not wait to be told again. By now we were surrounded by the occupants of the hut. When the tablets eventually disappeared down the child's throat, we were overwhelmed by laughing comments from the bystanders. The chief's stern face relaxed, and he went away as silently as he had come. We thought our job was done, but just as we were about to leave them, Moro Pipo showed us his forearm and murmured apologetically, "Chidi, sick," and adding a request to be given a tablet too. The whole of his left forearm was terribly swollen. A reddish rash and acute sensitiveness showed that he had a painful infection. His wife made light of his anxiety, and, laughing mockingly, she violently squeezed the injured part. Moro Pipo made no complaint, but his face revealed the excruciating pain. The bronze changed to ashen gray. The chief's daughter was still laughing as we sterilized a lancet. As soon as the steel blade pierced the flesh, a spurt of thick pus splashed out upon us. We applied lukewarm compresses, and after pressing the wound, we cleansed it and gave an injection of penicillin. The Indian did not so much as bat an eyelid, but stood there stock still. After we had bandaged him, we found ourselves confronted by more patients. We had to treat headaches, malaria, lung infections, chronic conjunctivitis, owing to their practice of continual depilation of the eyelashes, and other infirmities for which we had no remedies or efficacious palliatives. It was much better to leave these to the natives' own treatment, which was to cut the affected part with sharpened takuara canes to make it bleed profusely, in the belief that the pain would thereby flow out of the body and they would be cured. The savant had no effective knowledge of how to combat internal disorders, but he possesses an interesting cure for external wounds caused by accidents peculiar to his hunting experience. He uses a disinfectant and cicatrizant, the ashes of certain wood and spider webs, each for a particular kind of dressing, which he applies to the wound direct. Among the circle of savants whom we knew, there was one little boy of about 4 who always fled from us in panic, just as a white child would do if it saw 2 savant Indians approaching. This prevented us from intervening to heal a terrible gash the boy had in his calf, so deep one could all but see the bone. We were admiring onlookers at what I would have said was an impossible cure. Carried out by the natives themselves, they took the boy to the river, and the mother rinsed and wiped the wound with a handful of pieces of a thin tree bark, which on contact with the water became a foamy substance. Evidently the bark was endowed with some extraordinary curative power, for the child's wound was healed completely. I made a collective of these kinds of bark, but they, together with many other things, were lost when, in a civilized zone, part of my equipment was filched from me. Let it not be thought that these savants are an ailing people. On the contrary, they possess a robust and most vigorous constitution. Their bodies, despite the exhausting life they lead, approximate to what we regard as physical perfection. I know of no other South American native tribe at present which is their equal in this respect. It would be necessary to go back to the indigenous people of the north of the American continent to find a comparable physique. The nations of the Sioux, Cheyenne, Dakota, Blackfoot, Comanche, etc. Animosity against us was disappearing. The surest signs were certain indications which, though trivial in themselves, were highly eloquent when coming from the savants. The fetching of water from the stream was quite a problem. We had none of the practical vessels of the Indians and lacked the vital energy of the women. The distance was not great, some 300 yards, and this the Indian women covered cheerfully with pots and gourds on their heads a dozen times a day. They walked without a stumble, dodging nimbly among the branches that protruded across the path. For me it was a feat to perform, trying not to spill the water out of our plastic bowls and canvas bucket. The twists and turns of the path, the tree trunks, and a motley agglomeration of bamboos across the track invariably robbed me of a goodly proportion of the precious liquid. So when that same evening they filled all our containers with water for us without our even asking for any help, we were pretty sure that things were beginning to change for the better. That evening was to furnish us with a memorable event, even though every day when the sun went down the same acts took place. Meetings of the councils, the dance dedicated to evening. Never would we be able to regard this particular evening as quite like the rest, for then it was that the dancers took me by the hand and thrust me into their midst. It was an evening of triumph for us, with the exception of the council of elders. Everyone was watching me attentively while the dance of evening went on. When it finished, the women embraced Norma and then me too, with the result that my shirt underwent a change of color. My wife's blouse on my own shirt were christened Dance of Evening, because of the quantity of Eurocome they received in the demonstration of affection. Ever after that, when the fires were made up for the cooking of the evening meal, those were the garments we chose to wear, in order not to overtax our limited wardrobe in case of any further effusive demonstrations. The cooling of the friendship we had enjoyed with the boys of the Wastep still remained a mystery. It was Prena, our constant friend and mentor, who solved it for us. In a way we found most disagreeable, the Wastep, now warriors in fact as well as name, behaved towards us with arrogance and studied insolence. Only very occasionally, and then more or less by chance, did they allow themselves to be seen. When they did so, they adopted a contemplative attitude which lacked the sincerity we had known before. If we congratulated them on their now being warriors, they became more surly. If we reminded them that it was only a month before, only one moon, that we were laughing together, their sullenness took on the appearance of embarrassment. We resigned ourselves to the change. What was happening to them happens to all boys when they get to the threshold of manhood. 7 warriors about 15 years of age had formed part of a clan. They had married and were now living with the girls' families. In future they would obey the orders of the captain of that clan and be no longer bound by those of their parents. As a prelude to this important step they made in the most impenetrable part of the jungle a fiber mat from the poem called Shishu. In that voluntary retreat they meditated at length upon what lay in store for them, and nobody blamed them if they wanted to remain bachelors a little longer. However, there was no difficulty about their choice of their brides. Like all Zavant warriors, they had known since childhood who were going to be their wives. This was preordained not only by their own and the girls' parents, but also by the Council of Elders. As a safeguard against consanguinity, if husband and wife did not get on together, the pact was regarded as broken, and each of them could choose another partner more to his or her liking, after obtaining the consent of the Council of Elders. But if the warrior, having reached marriageable age, did not make use of his opportunity, another warrior would take his place, with the result that the former would run the risk of remaining a bachelor against his inclination, for there were not enough marriageable girls to go around. Therefore the alternative did not give much food for thought, and the young warriors hastened the very simple preparations for married life. Simple indeed, for once they possessed a mat, they took it, together with the rest of their belongings and their weapons, to the hut of their wife-to-be, and moved in. They also took with them a supply of game, abundant or otherwise, according to the luck of the hunt. A place in the Moloko was assigned to them, and the marriage was a fact. The honeymoon did not comprise any prolonged period of isolation, At the most, the bride did not turn up at the hut at midday, and neither did the bridegroom. I should perhaps add that the man and woman of these tribes belong to the tribe. The man's presence may be required at any moment. In his sexual relations, the Savant is very modest and circumspect. He will never exercise his marital rights in the hut, even in the night and in the most complete darkness. He will always seek some out-of-the-way spot in the jungle, and he will go to the rendezvous by a different path from that used by his partner. The method used by a girl's parents to impose celibacy when the bride is too young for marriage was simple but ingenious. They shaved off the girl's hair and stipulated how long it had to grow before she could marry, which might be until it reached to her shoulders or even to her waist. The required length depended upon the age of the promised one. Such a verdict is always accepted without protest by the bridegroom-elect. There was one Indian of formidable appearance named Fabre. He had a splendidly muscular frame. He used to like talking to me. What we could not convey in words we managed to say to each other by signs and comparisons. Once he confided to me in sad tones that his wife was very, very pretty but too young. He wanted me to meet her, so he took me to her hut. The surprise I got took my breath away and prevented the utterance of the flattering comments I had been preparing to express. His wife was a little girl of about 10. When he told her to get up from the mat in order to show me where her hair would have to come to before the wedding could take place, my surprise turned to amusement. Beside him, his wife looked the size of a baby. When he repeated to me more disconsolately than ever how long her hair would have to be before she could really be his wife, I had to cover my face with my hat so as not to let him see I was laughing. I was curious to know about the life of those who were obliged to remain bachelors against their will. In other tribes, the rampant desires of puberty are satisfied by making do with somebody else's wife or coquettish girls. One day I decided to have a word with Ab, a very good friend of mine, on the problem of sex. I waited for him near the place where he used to go to bathe. I heard a sound in the undergrowth, but instead of Ab, a slim young girl was coming along the path. She was graceful and well-built. Her flirtatious spirit revealed itself in her long, well-combed hair and a certain something in her walk. She did not see me, which I thought most strange, for the savant, whether man or woman, can hear the most incredibly slight sounds. She must have had her mind on something else. Noiselessly, when she entered the stream to draw water, Abe appeared. The girl gave no sign of uneasiness or astonishment. She finished filling the container and went. Abe did not speak, but went after her. My detective spirit might have urged me to follow them, but no, the ties of civilization still bound me as firmly as when I first set out on this expedition. I went instead to Prena, my encyclopedic informant. His reluctance to answer me caused him to talk about anything but what I wanted to know. Finally, without looking at me, he explained the girl belonged to another great savant village, that of Chief Babati. She was a widow. Her husband had died in the parent village during a visit he had paid some time ago. For fear that her husband's parents might accuse her of witchcraft and condemn her to death, the girl had stayed in the parent village. The unmarried warriors could approach her and other widows if the women did not refuse them. I awoke with a start. I had been sleeping peacefully without nightmares or disquieting dreams. I glanced around and was just going off to sleep again when I became convinced that something was happening or was about to happen. It must have been a good hour after daybreak, yet the Indians were still on their mats. They hardly spoke, and when they did, it was in a whisper. Usually at this hour they would have been busy at their tasks for some time. Now I was no longer in doubt. Something very important was going to happen. The water vessels did not contain a drop of water, and that first thing in the morning was such an unusual departure from Zavant custom that investigation was called for. As the Indians showed no signs of uneasiness, I was not alarmed. I woke Norma and conveyed my suspicion to her. As we slept almost fully dressed, we were ready in a moment, in order to have some natural pretext for leaving the hut and delving into the mystery. I picked up a vessel and made as if to go to fetch water. At the same instant I heard a cough. It was Prena, who was warning me by a shake of the head not to go out. Suddenly I found myself linking the silence and the fact that the tribe was confined to their huts, with a threat of death. Instantly 101 crazy ideas raced through my head. Outside our hut there suddenly arose a howl that made me shudder. It was not a chant, nor a song, or a signal. Intense, long drawn-out yells, which, on reaching a crescendo, would cease, and be followed immediately by a short, stifled cry. The chief was not inside the hut, and I was determined to see outside. Slowly expecting at every step to be halted, I moved towards the doorway with my heart in my mouth. I passed the strip of half-light to where the full sunlight glared upon me as I stood beside the narrow aperture. The chief and the important captains had their backs to me, seated on trunks of the buriti palm. Around them, in a semicircle, were some 10 warriors. The chief was saying something when he stopped talking. His place was taken by Sirubre, the tribal official and executioner. As soon as he took the chief's place, the warriors turned and in 2 swift leaps seized the spears that had been plunged into the ground beside them. Their mouths were painted black, the sign of a war of vengeance, raising the weapons and holding them like clubs. They uttered those terrifying yells and buried the ends of the spears in the ground once more. They were not the long, heavy spears, painstakingly polished and always gleaming. These were rather like a kind of mace, made of rough-hewn wood and ending in a bulging knob. I was witnessing the preparations for an immediate vengeance raid. Who could have offended the tribe? Might it be white men navigating the river of the dead, some expedition, some seekers for gold or diamonds, or some member of the tribe itself who had violated its inflexible code? Emotion and uneasiness prevented me from controlling my senses with sanity and calm. At the touch of a hand on my arm, I could not suppress a start. It was Norma asking me about the ceremony, without turning around because I didn't want her to see how agitated I was. I told her some nonsense. Once again the howling was repeated, but this time Sirubre too raised a club in his right hand and set off at a nimble trot towards the jungle, followed by other warriors. I urged Norma to get back to the hammocks. Bewildered, she did so. Shortly afterwards the chief and the captain came in. Hardly had they done so when the village emerged from its lethargy, and women and warriors went about their work. I tried to glimpse in the chief some change of demeanor, but untroubled by whatever orders he had given, he was soon making short work of his usual green beans. Prena had foreseen that I should ask him about the ceremony. When I took a place beside him, he simply stated that he was going out hunting all day, picked up his bow and arrows, and left me again. Against whom could the punitive expedition be directed? I never could find out for sure. Prena did not want to tell me, and I did not insist too much. He was a good friend up to a point. I did not care to know what lay beyond that unknown limit. What I do know is that 2 days later the warriors returned, without the clubs and without their ornaments and paint, and that same afternoon they all went to the forest to make themselves new bracelets, necklaces, and waistbands, and to cover themselves with another thick coat of uricum. 1 year after our homecoming from these territories, we recalled that incident when Irubuena of Xavantina was caught and murdered by warriors from this parent village. I considered it a complete waste of time to organize psychological tests for the purpose of classifying groups of Indians of characteristics like the Xavants according to their intelligence. My observations were those of everyday and therefore natural to life in the village, without causing any disturbance or interruption of the work-day tribal community. A gesture, an answer, or an action told me more about the character of the Xavant than a whole notebook full of test findings. I was now arriving at the stage which was ideal for the study of these people. I was beginning to be considered as an integral part of the village. Little by little they forgot the superiority and scorn they felt towards the white men, but the slightest detail would be enough to remind them. I had presented them with an abundant supply of boxes of matches, which we had spent endless patience in drying after the capsizing of the canoe. They accepted them more to please me than anything else. They struck several in my presence, and when I thought they were marveling at them, they smiled at me craftily. I explained how eminently practical it was to use these things instead of taking all that trouble to obtain fire the way they did. Although in the village they have a fire which they never allow to go out, when they are hunting or on the move from place to place, they have to resort to the fire stick, wede usik, by rubbing this thick, about half an inch in diameter and 20 inches long, on another one of the same dimensions, placed horizontally on the ground, and after exhausting efforts they obtain a diminutive ember on which they then lay a thin, dry palm leaf. They blow upon it to make it burn and add dry straw until a small flame appears, which eventually becomes a fire. The warrior whom I was addressing interrupted my convincing sales talk with a question. Why we have no more of these fire sticks? How do we get more? It was an axiomatic conclusion. The next day I saw that this indifference had spread throughout the tribe. The boxes of matches were lying about on the floor of the huts, with no one, not even the children, showed any interest in them. Norma and I hurriedly gathered them up because to us, poor civilized dopes who were incapable of producing fire by the Xavant's method, these matches supplied a real need. That Indian, whom we christened Mo-Ro Pipo, had formed the habit of keeping us company. His practice of choosing the most inappropriate moments to be with us was causing me to ignore him. Mo-Ro Pipo would come up to us as soon as we had cooked some of the scanty food we still had left, and of course we had to invite him to share our meal. Or as soon as we reclined in our hammocks for our siesta, he would start milling around beside the equipment, opening boxes and turning everything inside out. My wife found him a likable fellow. She thought up a peculiar way of returning his visits, an idea which struck me as worthy of Solomon, and of which I heartily approved. As soon as the Xavant started on our equipment, Norma hurried over to his place, and taking his baskets down from their pegs, started turning over his things. This practical application of the law of retaliation met with the approval of the other savants, for with the exception of Mo-Ro Pipo, they regarded other people's possessions as sacred. The turn of events cured him. After that he came to see us without laying hands on our property, or suddenly coming out with a loud in an attempt to scare us. How he became a sincere friend of ours and put me in possession of a tribal secret began with my beard. Many ethnologists and explorers have dwelt upon this addition to the white man's face and upon the admiration it awakens in the Indians who are beardless. With this in mind, thinking it might be a help to me in my attempts to penetrate the Xavant territory, I had grown a short beard. I found it only a nuisance, and it bothered me continually. And as the Xavants evinced an Olympic indifference to my torture, I decided to waste no more time before shaving it off. I had forgotten that in the accursed overturning of our canoe, I lost my razor and had nothing to shave with except some safety razor blades. I had never tried shaving without a razor before. To do so now, using only washing soap and the blade, took me an inordinate amount of time. As soon as I began the delicate operation, Moro Pipo sat down beside me and watched me unblinkingly. His eagle eyes sought out every little hair that had escaped the swath, and he drew my attention to it until it was duly extirpated. When I finished at last, he breathed a sigh of satisfaction, and so did I, at being released from his severe attentive scrutiny. I used to let him run his hand over my face. If he found it smooth, he would exclaim, "Péché dit, good," and indicate his own beardless cheek. If his fingers brushed against my moustache, he used to frown and advise me to get rid of it, as also of my eyelashes and eyebrows, as the savants did, saying, "On no dit, ugly or bad." I gave him the used blade, but his friendship with me really sprang from the fact that it took me such a long time to shave. I did so every 2 days, because in that way I showed I must be a chief of my tribe, since only chiefs and captains were going on a visit to another village. Take such a long time over their toilet, combing their hair and painting their bodies. One day, when I had given him some cartridge cases, fishing hooks and a knife, he whispered in my ear that I was to meet him somewhere along the watercourse at sundown. It is extremely difficult to make out what a savant says when he talks of some confidential matter. His voice is scarcely a breath. I met him by the stream, not without a certain amount of diffidence. When he saw me, he came up to me and put something in my hand, saying, "Chiri me." I didn't understand and looked at the shining blackish object that resembled some hollowed-out fruit. Moro Pipo took it back, somewhat irritated by my ignorance, and put it to his lip and blew. A thin, shrill whistle sounded through the surrounding jungle. Then I remembered this was a mysterious whistling sound I had heard from the hut in the night during the ritual called Weya. As I still did not seem to be sufficiently elated, he told me something which really did excite me. The whistle must not be seen by women. It only belonged to proven savant warriors of acknowledged prestige. Anyone who possessed it and knew how to use it would be known by the savant tribes to be their friend, and they would not harm him. He was giving me a safe conduct that I had never imagined even existed, and much less that I should ever be the possessor of one. Moro Pipo went away with furious steps, and I stood there deep in thought until the evening chill roused me from my meditations. Could it be true? I would test it at the first opportunity. That's what I thought, but fate determined otherwise. In other words, the white man possesses, the savant dispossesses. Something disturbing and unforeseen awaited us.